I was talking to a friend recently. The kind of guy who seems to have the traditional definition of manhood down to a science. He's always been the stoic one, the dominant force in the room, the guy who shoulders every burden without ever showing a crack in the armor. To anyone watching, he's the picture of resilience. But then, as the conversation drifted into the late hours, that armor suddenly slipped. He didn't complain about his job or his bills. Instead, he confessed that despite looking like he had it all under control, he was constantly fighting off this specific invasive thought that attacks him like a ninja in the dark. A quiet, nagging voice that simply says, "It doesn't matter."
That phrase right there, "it doesn't matter," is, well, it's profoundly telling. It just captures the essence of that existential worthlessness, that internal void that's so often hidden behind this meticulously crafted facade of capability.
It was such a jarring contrast. I mean, here was a man perfectly performing strength for the world, yet internally he's just standing on the edge of an abyss. He was paralyzed by the fear that admitting he was overwhelmed would instantly mark him as a failure. He literally believes that to speak about his pain is to deny his own utility. And when you look at the data specifically, the jarring statistic that men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, you realize this silence isn't just a personality trait. This performance of strength isn't just exhausting, it is literally killing us.
It is. And when we approach suicide as a critical global public health concern, which it absolutely is, these gender disparities just force us to confront the sociological complexity of the issue.
Yeah, we always hear that simplified statistic, men have higher suicide rates, but we really need to break down why that disparity exists between the completed acts and the attempts.
The difference is striking, and it is absolutely crucial for our understanding. You see 2 very distinct patterns. Men have significantly higher rates of suicide fatalities, completed acts. Women, on the other hand, demonstrate higher rates of non-fatal attempts. This stark difference in the outcome, rather than the frequency of the thoughts themselves, it strongly indicates that the methods men choose, and crucially their extreme reluctance to seek help or express any distress, are driven by factors that are unique to their gender roles, to the prescribed standards of masculinity.
So our mission today is to really unpack this lethal silence. We need to look at the rigid sociological blueprint that governs men's behavior, the psychological barriers that silence them, and the systemic policy changes that are required to address all this. We're investigating how this pressure to be the strong, silent type has just metastasized into a full-blown crisis. All right, so if we are going to understand this blueprint, we have to start by defining the concept that researchers keep pointing to, hegemonic masculinity, or HM. It sounds so academic, but it describes a very, very real pressure every man faces.
It does. Hegemonic masculinity is much more than just being male. It's the culturally idealized, often aspirational, expression of male behavior within a specific society at a particular moment in time. Think of it as the gold standard, the top of the pyramid, that men feel compelled to strive toward, often completely unconsciously.
And in our societies in the West, what does that blueprint look like?
In Western industrialized nations, this blueprint emphasizes dominance, control, professional utility, aggression, physical strength, and above all else, emotional restraint.
And what makes it so harmful from a mental health perspective is how it dictates what you have to avoid.
Exactly, that's the key. HM operates by strongly emphasizing distancing from any behaviors perceived as feminine. So anything associated with vulnerability, domesticity, or, crucially for our topic, seeking help, is rejected.
It's seen as a weakness.
It's seen as a fundamental failure of masculinity. The core belief that's reinforced by patriarchal norms is that repressing emotions, especially those related to tenderness, fear, or sadness, actually enhances one's masculinity. If you feel fear, you are weak. If you suppress it, you are strong.
But men are not emotionally blank, so the system has to provide some kind of acceptable outlet for distress. How does HM manage that hierarchy of emotion?
It creates a very clear, very rigid hierarchy. Certain emotions are valorized because they align with dominance and action. So these would include aggression, anger, and a kind of professional indifference.
Right. Anger is the big one.
Anger in particular becomes the acceptable psychological currency. It functions the ultimate mask, allowing men to conceal deeper feelings of distress, sadness, anxiety, or the fear of failure. So instead of saying, "I am terrified I will lose my job," a man might express that as generalized frustration or uncontrollable rage.
So the system gives you an outlet for frustration, anger, and aggression, but it labels genuine distress, sadness, or fear as a personal failing.
It's an inherent setup for severe internal conflict.
And that channeling of pain into something destructive like aggression or risk-taking is exactly what makes the system lethal. Does the research actually quantify the risk differential for men who are adhering to this internal conflict?
It does, and the figures should alarm policymakers everywhere. When you analyze men who strongly adhere to traditional HM norms against those who do not, the ones who do conform are 2.4 times more likely to die by suicide.
Wow. 2.4 times. That risk differential is enormous. It shows a clear sociological risk factor at play here. It's not just genetics or environment, it's the required performance of gender.
It is.
Okay, now here's the counterintuitive finding that you mentioned earlier, and this is where the psychology gets really complex. If they're 2.4 times more likely to die, logic suggests they would report high levels of internal distress, maybe even higher rates of suicidal ideation. But the data shows the opposite.
This is the paradox that really reveals the depth of self-stigmatization. The same research showed that men who identified strongly with HMA were 1.45 times less likely to report suicidal ideation. Yes, less likely. Even when responding anonymously to researchers. They may be internally suffering to the point of fatality, but that adherence to the Stoic ideal is so powerful that they cannot even admit those thoughts to themselves, let alone a neutral research instrument.
So the cognitive dissonance is just massive. They're simultaneously believing I must be strong and silent while experiencing these overwhelming thoughts of self-harm. They are essentially failing their own masculinity test just by having the thought, which reinforces the need to suppress and deny it even more.
Precisely. They maintain the performance of strength right up until the final, fatal outcome. And this self-silencing has crucial implications for diagnostic tools. If a man presents to a doctor for a physical symptom, say unexplained stomach pain or chronic headaches, a physician relying on standard depression screening may miss the underlying psychological crisis entirely.
Because the patient refuses to articulate emotional distress.
Exactly. The symptom is somatic, but the root is sociological.
This self-silencing mechanism is what makes stories like Jim's so resonant. We encountered the case of Jim, a manufacturing supervisor, the guy who was the anchor of his family, the quintessential provider.
And Jim's situation offers a tragic window into how the burden of that provider role translates directly into an existential crisis. When he was laid off in 2021, instead of seeking support, which would signify failure under HM, he put on his work boots every morning at 6 a.m. He drove to a park and he sat in his truck for 8 weeks, pretending to go to work so his family wouldn't worry.
He was just terrified of losing that protector status that defined his entire manhood.
The entire thing.
He viewed unemployment and vulnerability as a total loss of worth. His note actually apologized for being useless. That word uselessness is so key. It directly equates self-worth with economic utility, an expectation structurally imposed by agents.
His actions really embody this idea that the psychological cost of perceived weakness, of admitting failure, vulnerability, the inability to provide, is perceived as higher than the cost of dying. He maintained the facade, the performance of having work, even after he'd lost his job and knew he couldn't maintain the charade forever.
All that anxiety and shame from the job loss was just channeled entirely internally.
Which led to a catastrophic breakdown because seeking help was simply not an option in his mental framework. It didn't exist.
Jim's story highlights a middle-class pressure point, but we need to pivot and ask how this lethal influence is compounded when we consider men who are already marginalized. I mean, does HM affect all men equally?
Absolutely not. And ignoring intersectionality is ignoring crucial risk factors. The detrimental influence of hegemonic masculinity is particularly amplified for vulnerable groups. This includes homeless men, adolescents, men grappling with depression or addiction, and those from minority ethnic groups.
So why is the impact compounded for these groups? If HMN is the ideal, why does it hit those already struggling so much harder?
Because intersectionality shows us how factors like social class, ethnicity, and gender collectively intensify the pressure to conform. Boys from economically marginalized areas, or those from minority ethnic groups, often face institutional exclusion in education, in employment, in the legal system.
Right.
And when this systemic exclusion combines with the internal pressure to conform to the dominant male ideal, to be financially successful, dominant, and in control, the sense of isolation and inadequacy is dramatically amplified. You're already struggling due to systemic oppression, and then feel you are failing the only acceptable definition of manhood, the cost is exponential.
So HM is the ultimate cruel irony. It sets an impossible standard, particularly for those with the fewest social resources to meet it, and then it punishes them by silencing their distress when they inevitably fall short. So we've established the blueprint, this hegemonic masculinity. Now let's explore the primary mechanism that keeps the crisis hidden. Self-reliance. It's a core tenet of traditional masculinity, but in the context of mental health, it becomes deadly.
Self-reliance is perhaps the most socially celebrated yet functionally dangerous component of HM. The research confirms that enforced self-reliance significantly elevates men's risk of experiencing suicidal thoughts because it actively discourages seeking any form of help, whether emotional, financial, or medical.
Because that's defined as dependency and weakness.
Exactly. So this means that men's mental health problems often remain a silent issue, not just to society, but often to the men themselves, until the symptoms become completely unmanageable.
It's just not on their radar as a possibility.
Precisely. The stigma surrounding mental health problems in men dictates that they are far less likely to seek professional support. So instead of acknowledging depressive or anxious symptoms, they often turn to serious self-harm or substance abuse, alcohol, illicit drugs, excessive gambling, or reckless risk-taking as forms of self-medication.
Or, and this is critical, as means to externalize their internal pain. And this externalization is where clinicians often miss the diagnosis, isn't it? The patient might present with an alcohol problem, but the underlying issue is depression that's just being masked by self-medication.
That's the clinical blind spot. The depression doesn't look like the textbook definition. It often presents as irritability, aggression, or high-risk behavior rather than sadness or crying. The man isn't suffering silently. He is suffering loudly through destructive actions that are often perceived by society and the health system as behavioral failures or addictions, not as symptoms of underlying affective disorders.
So the core mental health issue goes undiagnosed, delaying any kind of timely, effective intervention.
Yes, often for years.
How early does this emotional suppression start, and how does it just perpetuate itself across the lifespan?
The process starts very early in socialization, often subtly reinforced on playgrounds and in schools. We see boys' tendency toward emotional neutrality or stoicism persisting throughout adolescence. Studies show that boys' friendships are fundamentally different from girls.
They're more activity-based, right? Less about talking.
Exactly. They are generally less expressive, less focused on confiding deep personal issues, and more centered around shared activities or competition. They learn very quickly that being tough and emotionally impenetrable earns social currency.
And the institutions that surround boys' schools, sports teams, they often reinforce this constraint.
They do, often unintentionally. Educational institutions frequently fail to provide the curriculum or even just the psychological space for boys to identify and articulate complex emotions. The focus tends to be on external performance grades, sports achievement, rather than internal processing.
So we're essentially graduating boys who can calculate calculus but can't recognize fear or sadness in themselves without just labeling it as anger or failure.
It's a failure to teach emotional literacy, and it creates a lifelong constraint, leading to emotional distress that underlies various mental health issues later on.
That pressure to be invincible must become just overwhelming when it's combined with specific traumas, particularly childhood trauma.
If we look at specific risk factors, one of the most devastating is the correlation between a history of childhood sexual abuse, or CSA, and a high conformity to masculine norms. This creates an intense internal conflict for the male survivor.
How so?
Well, CSA is inherently an act of control and violation, which fundamentally clashes with the culturally reinforced norms of dominance, strength, and control that masculinity demands. This violation leads to a profound sense of shame.
And how does that shame manifest into a higher suicide risk?
To cope with the shame and to try and reclaim a sense of control and dominance, some male survivors adopt what researchers call hegemonic or hypermasculinity. This is an excessive conformity to the stereotype. They might become hyper-aggressive, take extreme physical risks, or deny any form of vulnerability. They're attempting to conceal their experience by overperforming masculinity.
So the coping strategy itself becomes the risk factor.
Tragically, yes. This coping strategy, which is designed to assert control, dramatically increases their internalized conflict and ultimately the likelihood of suicide attempts. It's a heartbreaking cycle where trauma leads to shame, which dictates a hypermasculine defense, which then just compounds the risk of self-directed violence.
And this adherence to HM is also directly linked to the lethality of the suicide attempts, which connects back to that initial statistical disparity we talked about.
Absolutely. The adherence to HM is not just linked to internal psychological repression, it's linked to increased access to and use of lethal means. Traditional gender norms valorize aggression and the possession of weapons, particularly firearms, as symbols of masculine control, power, and protection.
Right.
So this cultural acceptance of weapon possession, combined with the difficulty in expressing distress non-violently or seeking professional help, means that when a man does reach a crisis point, he is far more likely to choose a highly lethal method. And that contributes directly to the higher rate of completed suicide among men compared to women.
We've discussed adolescents and younger men. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum. What happens when the HM ideal of invincible strength meets the reality of advanced age?
The conflict of aging it's devastating. The H ideal of perpetual independence, self-sufficiency, and invincibility clashes harshly with the realities of growing older, physical decline, dependency, chronic illness, ageism, and social exclusion, especially after retirement or the loss of a spouse.
And this is particularly pronounced for men over 80, right? They have the highest rates globally.
The highest of any demographic. And for this cohort, we are dealing with a generation that internalized the ideals of stoicism during eras like World War II and the Cold War, where emotional expression was seen as almost treasonous.
Exactly. For these men, often called the silent generation, the persistence of those deeply ingrained generational gender norms means that suicide may be conceptualized as a way to avoid dependency, a final act of control.
Researchers sometimes describe this as a form of compensatory masculinity. It's a desperate attempt to maintain the ideal of strength and control in the face of absolute powerlessness. Choose the time and method of their death is perceived internally as a final, heroic exercise of free will and independence, rooted in the absolute rejection of weakness.
So, the very qualities that define them, the rejection of weakness, the determination to persevere and be self-reliant, become lethal in old age because they prohibit these men from seeking the care, connection, and assistance they desperately need when they are most vulnerable. They choose death over the perceived shame of needing help. Given how deeply ingrained this blueprint is, from childhood suppression to the final fatal act of compensatory masculinity in old age intervention seems incredibly difficult. How do you even break through that cognitive dissonance?
That is the ultimate hurdle. Intervention requires addressing the inherent difficulty men have in recognizing and accepting their limitations, which is fundamentally tied to avoiding that intense cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
To seek help, they have to acknowledge that the traditional ideal of masculinity, the very thing they've built their identity around, is harmful to their health.
That acknowledgement can feel like psychological death.
It can. So we have to find ways to reduce the perceived discomfort associated with challenging these rigid norms.
Which means radically shifting the culture, often in the most traditionally masculine settings. This brings us to a compelling real-world example of deconstruction that I find fascinating, and it often takes place where you would least expect it. High school football fields.
These environments are the crucible of traditional HM. They are high pressure, competitive, and highly structured to reward aggression and emotional suppression. The story of the coach and the quarterback is profound because it actively rewrites the playbook right in the middle of that crucible.
Exactly. We all know the standard script. A high school quarterback throws a game-ending interception in the playoffs. He's expected to stand tall, shake hands, contain his devastation. That's the HM response.
Right. Tough it out.
But in this one clip, we saw something different. The boy was hyperventilating, completely undone by the weight of expectation. The coach took a knee, removed his own headset, and instead of yelling about toughness, he just pulled the kid into a hug, allowing him to sob openly on his shoulder in front of the entire crowd.
That coach demonstrated radical emotional literacy. He modeled vulnerability and acceptance in a place where only aggression is usually tolerated. He didn't focus on the play, the performance failure. He focused on the player's worth, separate from that performance.
He taught through action that disappointment and deep sadness are feelings to be processed, not weaknesses to be instantly repressed.
And that modeling is absolutely essential because it shows young men an alternative way to approach emotional challenges without sacrificing their sense of self-worth or competence.
So if the coach represents the micro-intervention, how do we scale that interaction? The core educational focus has to shift to providing boys with the tools to understand their emotions.
The shift must be systemic. Emotional education, similar to sexual education, must become a fundamental component of schooling, starting in early childhood. The overriding goal is to help boys understand that masculinity is not a monolithic concept. We have to abandon the single, rigid standard and begin discussing masculinities in the plural.
Moving to the plural, That means recognizing and validating the diversity within male experience, which inherently dilutes the power of that one hegemonic ideal.
Precisely. Interventions must deliberately highlight the diversity within masculinities by recognizing subordinate and marginal masculinities. This is crucial for prevention because failure to conform to rigid gender expectations is what so often leads to marginalization, oppression, and then subsequent mental health crises.
Okay, let's unpack that jargon. What does subordinate masculinity look like in, say, a school environment?
Subordinate masculinity refers to male behaviors or identities that are dominated or marginalized by the hegemonic standard. So think of the openly gay adolescent, or the teenage boy who prefers theater, art, or reading poetry over football and competition.
Right.
These boys are often excluded, bullied, or feminized because they embrace values like tenderness, creativity, or emotional transparency that differ from the HM mandate of rivalry, competitiveness, and physical strength. Their very existence challenges the standard, which makes them vulnerable targets.
And marginal masculinities, that sounds like the intersectional component we talked about earlier.
It is. Marginal masculinities intersect with factors like social class, race, and ethnicity. An adolescent growing up in a high-crime, economically disadvantaged neighborhood experiences masculinity differently than a wealthy suburban peer. He may still feel pressure toward physical toughness and aggression, but often as a means of survival or protection, not just for dominance.
So educational systems need to recognize that they are often judging all boys against this narrow, white, middle-class, heterosexual ideal, and that's exacerbating the sense of failure and risk for those who don't fit that mold.
Absolutely. Educational systems must actively assume responsibility for promoting gender equality and for training staff teachers, counselors, coaches to recognize and challenge these norms, ensuring that the staff is capable of discussing complex emotions and challenging toxic behavior without resorting to shaming the boys.
And beyond the traditional classroom, we are seeing social interventions trying to tackle the stigma using modern media.
Social media and multimedia resources are essential because they meet men where they are. The Australian Man Up campaign is a valuable example of utilizing documentary and online resources for suicide prevention. They found these resources were highly effective at raising public awareness about help-seeking barriers. And interestingly, they also noted that the public discussion of suicide and mental health is often approached more readily than issues concerning masculinity itself, which, again, it just underscores the deep discomfort and fear men have of confronting the limitations imposed by their gender roles.
And the Australian government is now intervening earlier than ever to counteract the rise of explicitly toxic online influences.
This is a critical development. We are seeing figures online who glorify and monetize the most harmful aspects of toxic masculinity figures who command massive followings among young men. So to combat this, the Australian federal government launched a 3-year Healthy Masculinities trial project. They're investing heavily to run face-to-face and online presentations directly in schools and sporting clubs.
How early are they targeting, and what is the specific focus?
They're targeting boys as young as 5 years old. The program is designed to counteract the explicit, harmful messages circulated by online influencers. Sources show that figures like Andrew Tate are influencing as many as 25% of teenage boys.
A quarter of them. Wow.
This initiative aims to foster respectful relationships, emotional literacy, and a healthy sense of self before those toxic norms becomes cemented and internalized by adolescents.
That strategy, using community interventions in sports clubs and schools to meet boys where they are, is a crucial tactical shift. It's active, preventative sociology, not just passively expecting men and boys to walk into a clinic.
It fundamentally recognizes the need to use empowering and active language in challenging HM values. However, researchers do caution that while social engagement is promising, we still need more rigorous scientific evidence to fully integrate these specific social and multimedia interventions into standardized clinical practice globally.
So we've established the lethal nature of the blueprint and the effectiveness of grassroots deconstruction. But for sustained change, you need systemic solutions. This brings us to national policy, and here, the global landscape is surprisingly sparse.
It is shockingly sparse, especially considering the scale of this public health crisis. As recent reviews highlight, only 3 countries globally, Australia, Ireland, and Brazil, have implemented national men's health policies. This illustrates a massive global oversight in recognizing and prioritizing male-specific health challenges that are driven by gender norms.
Let's start with a pioneering example that is over a decade old. Brazil's National Comprehensive Healthcare Policy for Men, PNAIH, launched back in 2009. What made this policy such a landmark?
PNAH was transformative because it wasn't just a basic health promotion. It was established through collaboration between the Brazilian Ministry of Health, academic leaders, medical associations, and civil society, ensuring a holistic, evidence-based approach.
So it was a true partnership?
A true partnership. And its objective was multifaceted. First, to specifically promote men's health tackling issues like occupational injuries and chronic disease, which are often just accepted as inevitable male behaviors. Second, and crucially, it used men's health as a platform to improve gender-transformative health care for both men and women, with the ultimate aim of advancing gender equality more broadly.
So they recognized that addressing men's restrictive gender norms was a way to improve the entire healthcare system. But what were the specific mechanisms PNAH used to encourage help seeking?
PAASH understood the barrier of stigma and access, so they implemented decentralized outreach units, often known as mobile health clinics, targeting men in workplaces, factories, and remote rural areas. They also worked to train clinicians in specific communication strategies designed to address male stoicism and distrust of the medical system.
So changing how doctors talk to men.
Exactly. For instance, they adapted clinical protocols to recognize that male health issues often present as somatic complaints rather than psychological distress, ensuring early intervention for symptoms that might otherwise be dismissed. It was an active, rather than passive, approach to health access.
Okay, now moving to a more recent example, England launched its first men's health strategy in 2025. This strategy seems highly focused on the statistical reality of premature death and inequality.
It does. Launched on International Men's Day, this represents a comprehensive action plan specifically designed to tackle the reality that men in England are dying nearly 4 years earlier than women, are less likely to seek preventative care, and are more likely to engage in harmful self-medication behaviors like excessive smoking, drinking, and drug use. The policy explicitly recognizes gender inequality in health outcomes.
And the financial commitments within the strategy are extremely targeted, right? Focusing on the highest risk group identified by the data, middle-aged men in deprived areas.
That targeting is strategic and necessary. The UK government announced a £3.6 million investment in suicide prevention projects specifically for that demographic.
Yeah.
Middle-aged men in economically deprived areas face this triple burden. The stress of maintaining the provider role, often with precarious employment, the entrenched stoicism of their generation, and the lack of community resources.
And these projects are co-designed with men who have lived experience, which seems critical.
Absolutely critical. It ensures that the solutions are practical, resonant, and not condescending.
They're also focused on community engagement, using powerful cultural levers like sport to break down stigma.
Meeting men where they are is the core principle. The strategy committed a further £3 million investment in broader community-based men's health programs. And crucially, they formed a major partnership with the Premier League's Together Against Suicide initiative.
That's just brilliant.
It harnesses the cultural, almost sacred power of football to deliver deconstructive health messaging. The strategy ensures mental health and help-seeking messages are embedded into the match-day experience, utilizing trusted figures and the shared language of the sport to reach millions of men who would never typically engage with a leaflet or a clinic.
That is incredibly intelligent policy, using a domain built on traditional hypermasculine values, football, to actively deliver a message of emotional vulnerability and support. It's redefining what team strength even means.
It legitimizes the discussion. And beyond mental health, the strategy includes targeted physical health improvements, recognizing that preventative physical health is often the first step in engaging these men. They included enhanced lung disease support for former minors and improvements for prostate cancer care, including the development of home PSA testing via the NHS app by 2027.
Which directly addresses that reluctance to visit a doctor's office.
Exactly. It's all about reducing barriers.
Policy is essential, but as we've seen, the culture has to grant permission for the policy to actually work. And we saw this cultural shift demonstrated so clearly in a London law firm.
This anecdote about the senior partner provides the necessary link between systemic policy and cultural acceptance. Law firms, particularly in finance hubs like London, are hyper-patriarchal environments where 80-hour weeks are badges of honor and vulnerability is career death.
And this particular senior partner, known for his Iron Man reputation, took a really radical step. He announced to the entire firm via a memo that he was taking a 2-month leave of absence specifically for mental exhaustion and therapy, and he detailed his struggle with anxiety and the toll the culture had taken on him.
And what's significant is the unexpected outcome. Initially, there was gossip predicting his immediate professional obsolescence. Instead, because he possessed vast social capital within that rigid patriarchal institution, his public modeling of vulnerability granted immediate systemic permission for others to follow suit.
Permission, that's the word.
Inquiries into the firm's mental health assistance program from junior male associates, the men who most feared career repercussions, triple in the following week.
He normalized the behavior. He showed that you can be successful, powerful, and still need therapy and recovery, directly challenging that fundamental notion that a leader must be an unfeeling, autonomous machine.
His willingness to share his struggle demonstrated that true utility and strength are not defined by silence or relentless endurance. It was a cultural intervention led by someone with the institutional authority to redefine what acceptable male behavior looks like in a high-stakes environment. Policy can build the resource, but only cultural permission allows men to use it without fear of being labeled a failure. #OutCheckOutro.
This deep dive has confirmed that the global story of male suicide is fundamentally sociological. It's driven by a restrictive, lethal blueprint, hegemonic masculinity, that forces men into emotional silence, which often presents as aggression, addiction, or risk-taking, making their distress invisible until it's too late.
The required path forward demands that the analysis of suicidal behavior be conducted through a plural, gender-sensitive, and intersectional lens. We've seen how gender expectations, shaped by cultural factors, generational mandates, and social class, fundamentally dictate how men cope with stress, express emotions, and seek help across the entire lifespan.
Yeah, that focus on self-reliance prevents help-seeking and elevates risk, from marginalized adolescents all the way to lonely older men utilizing that concept of compensatory masculinity.
Exactly.
But policy is starting to catch up, specifically in places like Brazil and England, where interventions are becoming proactive, meeting men in their communities, in their workplaces, and using trusted cultural institutions like football to normalize emotional literacy and deconstruct the harmful norms of silence.
And the systemic shift that's required is recognizing that the historically idealized man, the white, Western, middle-class, heterosexual man, has long been treated as the standard. He only becomes a target for intervention when he exhibits signs of failure, such as addiction, severe mental health problems, or homelessness.
And those outcomes are viewed internally and externally as personal failures or signs of weakness,
rather than being recognized as systemic health challenges that require gender-sensitive solutions.
The path to reducing male suicide involves implementing educational and systemic processes that highlight the devastating costs of emotional repression, thereby ensuring that utility and strength are no longer defined by silence, and ultimately creating tailored support systems that honor the complexity of masculinities.